Shout it now, there's no one who can doubt it now. So let's tell the world about it now. Happy days are here again. Your cares and troubles are gone. There'll be no more from now on.
Those were the upbeat tunes of the early 1930s as the nation welcomed a new president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the governor of New York, 2 terms, and his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, the daughter of the younger brother of Theodore Roosevelt, a formidable presence in her own right. Yes, Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt were cousins. They were 6th cousins once removed, which means that I am probably closer related to all of you all in the class than they were to each other. But they did have the same last name as they came from the same family. Eleanor was as formidable a presence as her husband, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was. And so, in this section, we will deal with the New Deal. In the person of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the election of 1932, Roosevelt's first 100 days, which seems to be a standard or a benchmark by which we measure presidents often, we'll see the New Deal in action, and then the attacking of the New Deal, the pushback against the New Deal, and then the second 100 days. You see Roosevelt standing tall against the railing, against the wheel that steers the ship. I'm going to get it out of me eventually. Notice how he is standing. Franklin Delano Roosevelt came from the branch of the Roosevelt family known as the Hyde Park Roosevelts, which existed up the Hudson River, whereas Oyster Bay Roosevelts were out on Long Island. Franklin Roosevelt was a Navy man, like his cousin Theodore. Although he was a Democrat, Theodore was a Republican. He was the vice presidential candidate, as I showed you, in 1920. But soon after 1920, he was paralyzed by polio. It nearly claimed his life. It nearly took him out of politics. But through a serious regimen of exercises and bathing in the hot mineral springs of Warm Springs, Georgia, he recovered. He delivered the keynote address at the 1924 Democratic National Convention. He then was elected governor of New York, succeeding Al Smith in 1928. The governors of New York at the time served only 2-year terms, and so he served 2 consecutive terms as governor of New York. In 1932, he was nominated for president, and he was married to Eleanor Roosevelt, his 6th cousin. The election of 1932 shows Hoover running for the GOP and Franklin Roosevelt for the Democrats, who promised a New Deal. Franklin Delano Roosevelt won in a landslide, 57 to 43% in the popular vote. You see there young Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who lived a very privileged upbringing. The Roosevelts were old money, and he was a very, very affluent young man. Herbert Hoover, on the other hand, who had come out of practically nothing. And yet it is Franklin Roosevelt who is identified more closely with the needs of the common man, and Herbert Hoover who is identified more closely with the needs of the affluent and out of touch. Without attempting to be denigrating in any way, Eleanor Roosevelt, who suffered a great deal after her father died, her mother was a very, very lovely woman and never ceased to remind Eleanor that she wasn't as good looking as she was. And it developed Eleanor into something of a complex until, at a certain point, she just simply did not care anymore about her looks. She married Franklin, and despite those looks, they did produce 6 children together. Franklin loved his wife in a respectful, husbandly sort of way. Was there a real passion there? We're not exactly sure, because we do know that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had other affairs. Nonetheless, they had a true partnership in their marriage, and it grew over time. But Franklin Roosevelt did not eschew his lady companions on the side. You notice I said that Franklin Roosevelt was standing at the rudder of the ship, steering the ship. Well, this was one of the things about Franklin Roosevelt and the press. In those days, there was an unspoken agreement between Roosevelt and the press. The press would never photograph Franklin Roosevelt in a wheelchair or on crutches in any sort of way. Roosevelt never really fully regained the use of his legs, despite his strong swimming in Warm Springs, Georgia. And you can see just how spindly his legs were. And he always had to carry, whenever he walked around, 10 pounds of steel, these steel braces. He never really had the full use of his legs again. He was just able to use the braces to sort of pivot himself back and forth in places. He always had somebody attending to him, and he was never, again, ever photographed in his wheelchair. Having been afflicted with paralysis of his own, Roosevelt began a program that would try and combat infantile paralysis. This would later be called the March of Dimes, and it was called the March of Dimes because people were asked to simply scrape up whatever dimes they could. And people mailed in nearly $2 million worth of dimes to President Roosevelt's office. The March of Dimes allowed now Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell to overcome polio as a child. The March of Dimes is one of the things that is being targeted in the health care cuts. One of the characteristics that made Roosevelt very appealing to the American people, as opposed to Herbert Hoover. Hoover had a rather high staccato voice. Franklin Roosevelt, on the other hand, had a very beautiful lilting voice that spoke like this quite a bit. And when he got up to speak at his inauguration, he said, "And so, my fellow Americans, we have nothing to fear but fear itself." And that is his way of talking to the American people. Reached out to them. It reached into their homes and into their hearts in many ways. Almost immediately, Roosevelt goes to work. He puts together some of the best economic minds in the nation, those that had not ruined the nation's economy. He calls it the Brain Trust. In a show of bipartisanship, he reaches out to Republicans on the other side of the aisle and says, "We may not like each other, we may not get along, but we're in this together, and I need your help." Immediately, they passed the Emergency Banking Bill to create the Federal Reserve and the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to buttress banks. That is, banks that were failing or banks that were on the verge of collapse or had collapsed would now be bailed out. And not so much that the banks would be bailed out, but the people's deposits would be bailed out. When you go to the bank and you still walk up to the teller window, or you go through the drive-thru, you see the seal on the bank that says FDIC. That is Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. That means that your money in that bank, should a bank fail, should somebody rob the bank, or should a bolt of lightning come down and dissolve all the assets of the bank, the federal government will back up your deposits up to $250,000 and so that you can have liquid cash to get back up and running again. He closes all the banks for a day, 24 hours. And you're going to read about that in your primary source exercises. Those banks that were on solid financial footing reopened the next day. Those banks that needed a little extra help took extra long. The banks that survived in the city of New Orleans were the Whitney Bank, which is right now bailing out First NBC, and First NBC at the time survived the Depression and the stock market crash. And you also had the Hibernia Bank, which ain't there no more because it's now Capital One, what's in your wallet. In order to bring the understanding of things to the American people, Roosevelt undertook what were known as fireside chats. Between 1933 and 1944, Roosevelt gave over 30 speeches to the nation. He called it fireside chats because you turned on your radio and you sat beside the fire and you listened to Roosevelt explain what was going on with a certain New Deal program. Or when the war begins, he explains to people what is going on in the war. This is very effective because it gives the American people a sense that somebody is trying and is advocating on their behalf, and gives them a sense that then he's not talking down to them. He is talking to the American people rather than at the American people. Things were not good in the United States at the time. Remember, I talked about the sodbusters way back in the Western notes that we had. The sodbusters had been plowing up the plains for decades on end, and now the bill was due. The drought came in, and the topsoil had been depleted. And this caused the entire topsoil of the western plains to turn into a fine powder called the dust. And this caused a massive migration from the plains to California. And no better, shall we say, example of this exists than in the movie The Grapes of Wrath, which was based on a book by John Steinbeck about the migration of the Joad family from Oklahoma to California and the trials and the struggles that they go through on their way. Now the New Deal goes into action. And what's happening here is that Roosevelt and the Democrats in Congress are essentially throwing spaghetti against the wall to see what sticks. Now, what do I mean by that? They're throwing programs out there to see what they can do and see if they can get the economy running again. They passed the Agricultural Readjustment Act, which is called the AAA. You're going to see an alphabet soup of programs. This pays farmers and livestock farmers subsidies to destroy their livestock and their crops to raise the value, what they had been doing during the farmers' holiday. But now they're doing it and they're getting subsidies. Well, this causes major problems for small farmers who couldn't afford to do that. And finally, they go to the United States Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court, which had conservative justices on it, were very opposed to the New Deal. And in the U.S. v. Butler case, it rules that the Agricultural Readjustment Act is unconstitutional. Roosevelt shakes off the disappointment and he moves on. He creates the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allocation Act to start planting trees on the plains. And now when you drive along the Great Plains, if you go through states like Nebraska and Kansas and you come up on farmhouses, you'll note that there are trees planted around them. Then the big one comes in 1933, the first big major piece of legislation, the National Industrial Recovery Act, called the NIRA of 1933. It creates a public works administration in order to get people back on the job, creating, building things, and it also creates the National Recovery Agency led by General Hugh Johnson. What the National Recovery Agency does is it fixes prices for those that join it and enacts pro-labor codes. Once again, though, businesses sue, saying that this puts an unfair and unconstitutional burden on them. The Schechter Poultry Company sues the United States in Supreme Court in 1935, and as a result of this, the NRA and the NIRA are found to be unconstitutional. Once again, Roosevelt shakes off the disappointment and moves on to the next thing. What we are seeing here is that the New Deal is not accomplishing everything that it's supposed to be accomplishing. But what it is accomplishing is that it's giving the American people confidence that the government is on their side. That female photographer you see there is for Life magazine. Her name is Margaret Bourke White, and she is one of the great chroniclers through photography of the Great Depression and also major world leaders later on in life. The bottom right, you see a small community about to be overwhelmed by a duster, the dust storm that it kicked up. Dust was so prevalent that there was actually dust on the Capitol building in Washington. That's how far the dust would travel. And people said that there were times in New Orleans where there was a fine coat of soot. Very faint, but there, definitely. And this was happening in Kansas and in Oklahoma and Texas and Nebraska and so forth. So that tells you just how far this dust was traveling. There's a great deal of resistance to the New Deal, and it comes from a variety of directions. It's not all from the conservative wing. He had a very popular radio program led by a Catholic priest by the name of Charles Coughlin. Charles Coughlin spoke about a number of subjects, but one of the big things he talked about was the New Deal. And he attacked it because he felt that it was really the tool of Jewish financiers. Charles Coughlin was a very anti-Semitic radio host. And eventually the Bishop of Detroit told him, enough is enough. And they ended the radio show. And Charles Coughlin lived a long, healthy life, dying in Detroit in the 1960s. And then, of course, there's the famous Governor Huey P. Long from Winfield, Louisiana. And he was the current senator from Louisiana. He created something that went even more extreme than Roosevelt's New Deal. He called it the Share Our Wealth Clubs. And it's very important for you to look up what the Share Our Wealth Clubs were, because this was really big-time leftist socialism entering in. He challenged FDR and the New Deal and was being considered as a possible opponent of Roosevelt in the 1936 Democratic primaries. In 1935, though, Huey Long made the mistake of questioning the parentage of a Opelousas judge by the name of Benjamin Pavey. And Pavey's son-in-law, Carl Austin Weiss, went to the state capitol to confront Huey Long, allegedly with a pistol in hand. And 61 shots later, Carl Austin Weiss was essentially obliterated by bullets, and Huey Long was shot once in the stomach. And he died of peritonitis because in those days medicine was just not as good and the doctors were atrocious. Then you had Dr. Francis Townsend, who advocated for the elderly, and he proposed a pension plan. He said the government needs to back up the American people with a pension plan of its own. And you know what's going to come out of this. And so you see, just like with the health care law of the 2009, many people who disagree with the health care law said it didn't go far enough. And many people who disagreed with the New Deal said it did not go far enough. Meanwhile, you had other people that said, no, this is not the role of government. Government should not be doing this. Too bad there's misery. Government is not the solution to this problem. Now let's look at Roosevelt's second 100 days. The most significant aspect of the second 100 days, which was really in 1935, so it's not back-to-back 100 days, is the passage of Social Security. Social Security, which is now a hot-button topic in Congress. What is it? What is Social Security? When you get a paycheck, you see on your paycheck a deduction called FICA, and that is Social Security. Social Security is payroll taxes and federal contributions, unemployment benefits, temporary assistance for needy families, health insurance for the aged and disabled, which we call Medicare. Been in the news a little bit lately. Grants to states for medical assistance programs. That is the building of hospitals and so forth. That's Medicaid. State Children's Health Insurance Program. That's SCHIP. And Supplemental Security Income. SSI. The Wagner Act, which was passed in 1935, is very much in tune with Social Security, and it creates national labor relations for the American people. You also have labor movements, a new organization not in competition with, but in collusion with the AFL, is the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO. Now it's, of course, they merged together, the AFL CIO, and they were led by the great labor leader, John L. Lewis, who, as great a labor leader as he was, they weren't as great as his eyebrows. And last but not least was the creation of a new labor force in the United States through what is known as the Works Progress Administration. And the man in the upper right-hand picture, Harry Hopkins, is the man who heads the WPA. What does the WPA do? The WPA is designed to put people from all walks of life back to work. It's not just like the Civilian Conservation Corps where you take adults and throw them out in the country. You are actually taking people where they are in their lives and using their professions and paying them to do things that are in line with their profession. Thus, writers are paid to write, and actors are paid to act, and builders are paid to build. I will explain even more as we go along. Here you see Roosevelt signing into law the Social Security Bill. Got the picture of Jefferson behind him on the wall. And I bring your attention to the lady behind him. That is Frances Perkins, the Secretary of Labor, the first female to serve in a U.S. cabinet. WPA cartographers were also put to work charting the coastal defenses of cities. Once again, there are interesting things happening in Europe and in other places, and Roosevelt knew that cartographers would be needed, and so he puts them to work. Notice men and women there working together, white men and women working together, I might say, charting the coastal defenses of the city of New Orleans, and they would chart other places as well.